No game. This is the... Sertraline, wasn't it? I don't care, card up there. I'm like immune to drugs, dude. I only stream because I'm about to eat, and I like eating and streaming and mukbang. At 4:29:59, my alarm will go off. I think, like somewhere 1 or 2 seconds before or after, because it tells me it's going off at 4:30. No, at 4:30:01, it will go off. I think. I'm pretty sure. I said it 12 minutes ago. It just happened to work out.
Can weave in song recommendations for your playlists when you join Spotify Premium. Or start a jam, where you can invite your friends to create and add to shared playlists, all with unlimited skips and repeats. Tap the banner to learn more.
Muscle spasm, the side effects. I'm not gonna tell them that, because that's kind of okay. Hold on, what time is it? 30, 33, close enough. That was a good guess. Okay, let's see when it goes off. Oh, okay. That's, well, it's a few seconds off. Well, fuck. Ari Piprazole. I was. Interesting, I got eye side effects. Different muscle spasms from the serotonin, I assume. My life be like ooh, ah, ooh, ah, my life be like man, fucking up smash. Stand, duck, and button mash. See that, bro? It's freestyle. Just writing down. So it's worse. Better, depending on the weather. Oh shit. Oh shit, broke. I need to turn off notifications if I want to hide that. Fuck all y'all. Fuck all y'all. Fuck off. Lance Reddick. Lance Reddick.
You know the sex guy from The Wire and...
Whoa. 2 minutes.
All y'all! All y'all! Warp speed, don't rainbow read me, nigga! Ah!
Fucking funny though. troubling questions. The contrived footy-looked lad. Oh, right. My life be like you.
Well now, we call this the act of mating, but there are
In Haidt's case, he was talking predominantly about the moral emotions. So, for example, if you outfit an organism, say me, with a sense of gratitude, to feel compelled to do something nice for somebody who's done something nice for me, then what you've done is you've provided the organism with a motivational push in the sense of an emotion in order to get them to engage in reciprocal behavior, which ultimately will allow them to be a good member of the group and be somebody who's not shunned, ostracized, but is actually accepted, respected, and hopefully has reproductive success within the group. If you outfit an organism with a sense of shame or guilt when they do something that is perceived to be immoral, then what you've done is you've outfitted them with a negative motivational force to avoid that type of misstep in the future and to pursue reparative behaviors, which will actually make sure that they're put back into good standing in the group. And so again, what you've done is you've selected for these cognitive modules which motivate people towards the behaviors that's going to allow them to be most successful. All right. So humans have then become the species with this most complex suite of moral emotions to engage in a very complex array of behaviors which we could consider moral. Humans are the organism that does stuff like this. Humans are the species of sportsmanship. Humans are the species of alloparenting. Humans are the species of volunteering at soup kitchens. And even from a more mundane sense, humans are the organism that can sit quietly and peacefully on a plane together for 8 hours at a time. This is an example that was put forward by Sarah Hardy, that if you put our closest cousins, the chimpanzees, on an airplane together, 80 of them, for 8 hours, when the plane landed at Heathrow, all you'd have is a bloody mess. They would not be able to survive in that peaceable state. Somehow humans have managed to do so. We are the species that's able to engage in this type of peaceable moral behavior. But we're also the species of this, and we're the species of this, and we're the species of this. And this juxtaposition between the peaceful, cooperative, moral species and this incredibly aggressive, violent species is what the anthropologist Richard Wrangham calls the goodness paradox. How is it that we can be both of these, an incredibly non-violent compared to our cousin species, and an incredibly violent species at the same time? The answer to that question lies on disentangling two different types of aggression. And what Wrangham argues is that we've had a decrease in what he calls reactive aggression. Reactive aggression is the spontaneous a violence that tends to be provoked in moments of threat. You fly off your handle and fight a guy who bumped you in line at the supermarket. That's reactive aggression. You see that type of aggression a lot in other mammalian species. That's the type of aggression that's involved when chimpanzees get in just fights between the two of them. You see this. This is red deers. They are being motivated by reactive aggression when they get into these mano-a-mano competitions. And for red deer, something between 13 and 29% of all male deaths are attributable to this type of violence. Now, if human beings had that same level of reactive aggression, then every year in Vancouver there would be about 4,000 homicides. Instead, last year there were 10. So humans have managed to tamp down considerably their reactive aggression. At the same time, though, we've ramped up what he would call the proactive aggression. This is instrumental violence, planned violence, violence that has a particular goal that you think about and you prepare for. And so here's the murder of Caesar by the Roman senators, something that was pre-planned and executed with great deliberation. Assassinations like this are a great example of this cold, methodical, rather than hot and impulsive type of violence. And it's something that we see much more in human species than we see in other species. You tend to see it a little bit in chimpanzees or wolves, but humans have taken it to an entirely new level. So why is it that reactive aggression has decreased while proactive aggression has increased? Wrangham argues that this is part of the same process. Now, before we get to that process, let's take a detour to talk about human self-domestication. We talked a little bit about this in the homosexuality lecture as one of the potential explanations for why homosexuality, homosexual behavior would evolve in humans, or at least be maintained in humans. We also talked about how humans underwent a massive expansion in the cranial capacity of the skull in the last 2 million years, and though that seemed to have peaked about 100,000 years ago, that doesn't mean that we didn't see any other evolutionary changes in even our skulls, let alone our psychology. If you look at Homo sapiens skulls from about 100,000 years ago compared to Homo sapiens skulls today, there are some notable differences. So what you can see here, on the left you have a 100,000-year-old African male member of our own species, and here you have a more modern one. You see you have much more pronounced brow ridges on the left. You have a much bigger jaw, generally a longer face, and a generally wider face. So if you compare these, you see that the modern male has a narrower face, has a generally more feminized face. And you could say, well, maybe it was this particular male, but these scientists in this study looked at thousands of skulls and noted that this is a systematic difference, something which has really changed over the last 100 years.
Don't I have that one? I don't know.
Years. Basically, our skulls have become more feminine and juvenile over the last 100,000 years. Now, what's going on there? Why has that happened? Well, interestingly, the changes that we've seen among humans parallel some of the changes that we saw in that experiment on the Russian foxes that I told you guys about last class. So if you recall, 45 generations of foxes were selectively bred such that only the 20% of them that were most willing to approach a human, that were tamest, were bred into the next generation. And compared to a control group that was bred randomly, you saw that this tame version went through a suite of changes that made them what we would call domesticated. They were highly willing to approach humans. They became more juvenile in form. The sexual dimorphism between the males and the females shrunk. They became more playful. They got floppy ears. They had a shorter tail. Interestingly, what happened in 45 generations for the foxes is a constrained version of the evolution of dogs from wolves. That's been a process which has been going on for about 15,000 years, but follows the same sort of idea. The various individuals of foxes who were most willing to approach humans had a selective advantage because they were able to feed off the scraps of humans 15,000 years ago and kick off this great relationship between dogs and human beings. Eventually, humans started artificially breeding dogs for particular characteristics, which is what's turned them into these little love machines. But you see some of the similar changes whereby they become more juvenile versions of themselves, sexual dimorphism shrinks, ears go floppy, and the tails got waggier. Interestingly, that also happened to the foxes. They developed waggy tails as well, which is a social cue. But what's most interesting about this is that this is the same process that is proposed to have been what humans went through as well. So you can see that we went from this sort of brutish-looking guy on the right to the more juvenile, feminized version of us on the right. Also note, by the way, the scleras of the eye going from
Yes,
dark
the
brown
whiteness.
on the right to white on the left. Same process which happened between wolves and dogs. If you look at primate species, of 92
I think
primate species, only 8
Sclera
7
differences would be
have white
representative
scleras. Most
or demonstrated. In any of the interbred species of humans, if it was not done really fast.
of them have dark scleras. Think about what that does in terms of our ability to communicate cooperatively with each other in terms of gaze direction. Anyways, this suite of changes has been called domestication syndrome, and it's characterized by, as we've talked about, reduced sexual dimorphism, with the males becoming more like the females rather than the females becoming more like the males, presumably.
That is because females are females. I think about that, and it's like they were like the gender that was raped, basically. So they were just kind of pushed away. And it's not that the females become more males, the males become more female.
Because there's reduced intrasexual competition.
Prey meaning.
We talked about how the differences between males from females is typically due to the necessity of males to fight off other members of their own sex. And the sexual dimorphism thus emerges on those features that they used to fight. If it's upper body strength that they used to fight, you see a bigger difference between females and males in terms of upper body strength. If it's the canines that are used to gnash at each other, you see bigger differences between the canines between females and males. In dogs, the canine difference between females and males is much smaller than that between males and female wolves. You see a subdued stress response, which seems to be mediated by higher levels of serotonin, which you see in the domestic version of the fox, you see in dogs compared to
Subdued stress response.
wolves, and you see in bonobo chimpanzees compared to their more aggressive, violent chimpanzee cousins. This also seems like it's motivated by lower testosterone. And in fact, the changes in skull shape seem to be associated with reduced androgen receptors, so reduced male hormone receptors, suggesting that we have decreased in the amount of testosterone reception in the male body over 100,000 years. And then finally, there's the increased tolerance of humans' play and prosociality. That's clearly true about dogs, that's clearly true about foxes, but it's suggested that's also true about humans. We became more tolerant of each other and more willing to engage in prosocial behavior. So how did all this happen? This is where we get to the quote that started the lecture. Human life in communities only becomes possible when a number of men unite together in strength superior to any single individual and remain united against all single individuals. If you look at the gorilla, we separated from our common ancestor with them about 10 million years ago. And what you see there is pronounced sexual dimorphism. We talked about this before, pronounced polygyny. What happens is that the male who dominates is always the largest, strongest one, because that largest, strongest male can always outcompete any other individual male. But what happens for humans is because we can cooperate, because we can band together with other members of our group, even the strongest individual male is not a match for the coordinated efforts of other males. And that's what you see in the case of Caesar, overwhelmed by a number of his other senators. And so what happened in humans is the selection for the single biggest male was curtailed by the fact that that was no longer the unique advantage that it had always been before. So specifically, this was kicked off by the process of language.
And that makes sense now, Wes, and yet those are so small. Because of teamwork.
Language allowed for a type of time travel. And what do I mean by that? Well, language allowed us to be able to communicate about things that happened in the past. That wasn't possible before. So if there was caveman Dave who would force himself upon women in the camp, now you'd be able to hear about it. It wouldn't be something that you could only experience yourself and then could communicate to no one. Now the past continued to matter into the future for other people. But language also opened up the future because it allowed us to plan. And so that was the second stage, the ability to coordinate future plans to engage in premeditated violence that you guys got together and made a plan for. And what that allowed for, according to this particular theory about the goodness paradox, is for tyrannicide, which is that if there were people like Caveman Dave, if there was some dominant individual who wasn't engaging in ways that were beneficial to the group, a bunch of men could get together and kill that individual. And so that changed the selection pressures now. It led to selection against the reactionary type of aggression that would make enemies within the camp. Because even if you were the strongest, toughest guy, if you engaged in that kind of jerk-ish reactionary aggression, you could still be taken down. In fact, you probably would be taken down. And at the same time, it selected for proactive, cooperative aggression, because that now became a tool which was particularly useful.
The general.
And so we became self-domesticated. We became a less reactive, subdued, more patient, more tolerant version of ourselves, at the same time as we became these excellent proactive planners who were able to engage in the type of proactive aggression that we talked about at the top of the class. By the way, that's the seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia in the United States, Sic Semper Tyrannis, death to all tyrants. And you see there Lady Virtue with her foot on the chest of a dispatched tyrant, the king. So note the similarities here between the process of self-domestication that we pulled ourselves through and the domestication of the foxes and wolves that we talked about before. Though what we were doing with them was a process of artificial selection, of selective breeding, where we were allowing some of the species to breed and disallowing others, that's actually very similar to what we were doing for ourselves. We were disallowing those who were most reactionarily aggressive, who had the characteristics that we deemed to be most threatening to the group. We were disallowing them from breeding. And so evolution was still working by making us more fit to our environment, but we weren't talking about the physical environment as much anymore. We were talking about making us fit to a social environment. So from this point in our development onwards, and for what we're going to be talking about now for the rest of the course, what we were actually adapting to was us.
Apparently I watched this. How is it that you have meaning, but I do not? And that frustrates the fuck out of me. I don't actually give a fuck about it. I just want to know what it is. Just so I could be like, oh yeah, ooh means that, eh? Cool. And not like I'll like build it into my. I probably will actually. No, I probably will. I don't really care though.
I'm a good guy for a gal.
All right, let's talk about intelligence. Now, we've danced around this topic a little bit so far. We talked about it when we were talking about mating. We talked about it when we were recapitulating the recent history of the human species. But now we're
Why
going
is
to deal with this question
recapitulate sum up, but capitulate is to give up?
head on. Why have we evolved a brain that's so big? To explain this, we're going to start with the case of the sea squirt. That's not what a sea squirt looks like. This is what a sea squirt looks like, broken down by different stages of its life. And the reason I'm breaking it down that way is because the sea squirt faces different challenges depending on the stage of its life. In the early stage of its life, it's a little tadpole-like creature that swims around in the ocean trying to find a rock to attach to. Once it finds that rock, it attaches to it, it stays there, and it just lets food flow into its mouth. So its life becomes much simpler in the later stage of its life than in the earlier stage of its life. And in that earlier stage of its life, it requires a more complex nervous system. So you can see here on your left, it has this nerve cord, which disappears later in its life. The reason for that is because this is a metabolically expensive piece of anatomy to have around. It doesn't need it later in its life, and so what it does is it eats it. It, instead of feeding calories to it, it uses it for its calories itself. The moral of that story is you only need as big a brain as your environment requires, and no bigger. And the reason no bigger is because brains are costly, and they're particularly costly for human beings. Those costs are broken down into two categories. On the one hand, they're metabolic costs. The fact is, you need a lot of energy to drive this power-hungry organ in your skull. Humans at rest use 1/5 to 1/4 of all their energy to just drive the brain. That's much more than you see among our primate cousins, and it's much, much more than you see among other mammals. These are expensive. So, in order to recruit that many calories for your brain, we had to change our diet. Meat provided a calorically dense source of proteins and fats that was necessary to actually sustain these types of brains in the ancestral environment. What's interesting about that is that in order for us to increase the amount of meat that we had in our diets, prior to having these big brains, we were scavengers. We were able to get a little bit of meat, but we weren't able to engage in the tool use and complex hunting techniques that were required to actually take down game, large game. As our brains increased in size, we were more able to do that, which gave us the fuel to increase the brains even further. So it created this iterative process by which we had the both wherewithal and fuel for brain increase. The other aspect is that it created this trade-off where we needed more stores of energy on our body in order to drive the brain. That led us to need to recruit more fat and produce less muscle. If you've ever seen a chimpanzee without hair, you'll know it's pretty damn jacked. That's a jacked, hairless chimpanzee. Compare that to a human being. Okay, so that's not the fairest representation of a human being, because that is usually us at our fattest. If you look at how our body fat ranges during the lifespan, we are at our fattest at that particular point in time. And the reason for that is because that's when we really need to be driving our brain growth. Between the ages of 0 and 1, basically 60% of all the calories that you take in are going to developing your brain, which means there's only 40%, a minority of all the calories you're eating, to do everything else, driving the rest of your body growth, as well as everything that you do as a little baby, rolling around, crying, whatever you do. If you look at the diets of our closest ancestor chimpanzees, you can see those in the bottom two rows. You have the chimpanzees and the gorillas. Look at the percentage of calories that come from fat, 6 and 3% respectively.
they're
Compare
vegetarian.
that to a modern American, 33% fat. And we can make our jokes about Americans, but you can see that that's actually within the range of modern foragers, which suggests that that is a natural level of fat that we crave for in our diet for a particular reason, and the reason is to sustain these brains. So like I said, brains are costly metabolically. They're also costly for the mother. So those of you who remember your Bible will know that the curse that was laid on Eve and all her women descendants was for giving the apple of knowledge to mankind, that is intelligence to mankind, was that she would suffer pain in childbirth for all her days. That's what happened. Intelligence has led to a much more harrowing childbirth experience for women. Having these big brains required, even at birth, much larger heads than we previously had, and this coincided with a time when women's pelvises were narrowing because of the needs of bipedalism. To walk upright, and to, in particular, run upright, you needed a narrower pelvis. So this is what you see for a chimpanzee giving birth. Lots of space, not so much space for a human being. The combination of these factors led to something that's called the obstetrics dilemma, which is a trade-off between the tensions of all these different forces pushing against each other. So on the one hand, you have infant brain size, as we've talked about. There must have been some sort of pressure to push the selection for these bigger brains. At the same time, you had an elongated dependency period of these infants. Unlike other animals, humans, as you know, are completely juvenile when they're born. They are completely useless when they're born. They can't fend for themselves at all for years. And part of the reason for that is because they have to develop so much that you can't fit all that time in utero. They often talk about the fourth trimester, right? This is the trimester after they're born, when they're still not fully cooked, but you had to bring them out because otherwise they would be too big. And so extending that infant dependency period is a cost in and of itself. We also talked about pelvic width. And then the other factor is mortality in childbirth for both the child and the mother. So here's another dimension of how much harder childbirth is for humans than our cousins. It lasts a lot longer, and is a lot more painful than it is apparently for the chimpanzees, gorillas, and baboons, our other great ape cousins. In the ancestral environment, and actually until relatively recently, the chances of dying, for the mother dying in childbirth, were 1% per birth. So if you have 6 or 7 kids, that's real danger. And all of these costs mean that there had to be some really good reason for our brains to grow so large. It must have been worth it from an evolutionary perspective. The math looks something like this. The adaptive benefits of having a giant brain would have had to exceed these metabolic and maternal costs. Moreover, because of the speed at which this increased, you guys remember those charts we saw where after about 2 million years, brain size just shot up rapidly. The speed at which something increases is a clue towards its adaptive benefit. So the fact that this happened fast must have meant that it was really worth it. So why? Why did it happen? Well, we're going to talk about 4 theories. Wallace's theory, Darwin's theory, Dunbar's theory, and Joe Henrich's theory. We're mainly going to talk about the middle 2 today. We'll talk about culture in the next class. We won't talk about Wallace very much because, as you guys know, at this point, Wallace just threw up his hands. He said, that's too big a leap. Evolution could have done that. Natural selection could have done that. I think some spiritual force had a
I
plan.
swear to
and
God,
came
if
in
there's
and
fucking meaning, dude. Why?
pushed things along at that stage to develop the human higher mental faculties. Now, Darwin wrestled with this a lot. He wrote to one of his friends, he said, every time I gaze upon a peacock's tail, it makes me sick. And it makes him sick because it didn't fit. Why would these ornaments, these seemingly useless ornaments, fit within his elegant theory of natural selection? But it prompted him to come up with the idea of sexual selection, and that's what he invoked to explain the development of the higher human faculties as well. That idea of sexual selection was expanded upon by Ronald Fisher, who was a prominent evolutionist in the early part of the 20th century. He was a key architect of the modern synthesis in evolutionary theory. And he suggested that there could be this
Okay, fuck
runaway
this, dude.
process.
I'm gonna fucking... I'm gonna go fucking sleep. Fucking piss me off with your prey meeting. Fucking piss me off. I'm not gonna fall asleep on stream. But I will fall asleep on stream. Just not streaming it. What? I don't know. I'm fucking dumb.